Baruch Spinoza. It's 360 years ago. He lived here and he was expelled. What on earth did he say or write that made the Portuguese Jewish community so angry?
Spinoza was a philosopher who thought that philosophy matters in real life and in politics and in social context. And one of the central features of his thought is an attack on what at that time was considered essential to religious authority. For Spinoza, miracles don't exist. The supernatural realities don't exist. And in fact, although Spinoza was a great supporter of toleration and individual belief, although no one was a stronger defender of freedom of conscience in the sense of individual belief, he was extremely suspicious of the way, collectively, religious belief is used, especially by politicians and statesmen in the political sphere. So religious belief, he noticed, can easily be used as a coercive force. And even as a young man, he began to rebel against religious authority. So the heresies, I think, were essentially connected not so much to what people believed, because neither the rabbis nor, in fact, in the Dutch context, any religious community were Inquisition-minded.
So he did not believe in miracles.
Nope.
He did not believe in God as a sort of superhuman figure who could listen, who could judge, and who could punish.
God in Spinoza is really everything, the reality of everything.
So not a man with a beard on a cloud.
It's not a knowing, governing force that decides, rewards or punishes, or intervenes in natural processes to make miraculous things happen.
Okay.
So for Spinoza, revelation is impossible. There can't have been a divine revelation. So it was seen as a denial of fundamental religious belief.
So what he said was shocking.
Terribly shocking
Terribly
for
shocking.
the 17th century mind, Christian or Jewish.
Yes.
That's essential.
Both of them.
Yeah.
And now there's this conference, later today, you're there too, and it's about the question, should this ban on Spinoza be lifted? What's your opinion on that?
Now, I think as a historian and as someone who thinks of him as a philosopher, one has to have two opinions. I know there's a danger if you say you have two opinions, that it sounds evasive. But I think it depends really on your perspective. If you, and even if you're within a Jewish context, on your Jewish perspective. I think if you're going to take the line of orthodoxy and of tradition and of rabbinic authority, then you have to say that the rabbis made the right decision, because from this perspective, he was a complete rebel and revolutionary who was rejecting religious authority.
So it's understandable that they did that.
The ban made sense.
I was curious about your opinion.
But if you believe that religion needs to fit with the other criteria of modernity, with democracy, with toleration, with individual freedom of thought, and this is what Reform Judaism, or what in the Netherlands is called the Liberale Joodse Gemeente, Judaism, or part of Judaism, has tried to reform itself in line with the Enlightenment. I think from this perspective, then they would say that the Orthodox rabbis were wrong,
right.
and that the ban should be lifted.
Yes. I was wondering, and I read something about that too, what Spinoza himself would have thought of this. I mean, this whole debate about the ban being lifted, he himself did not, as you explained, believe in religion, in God, in the way that was...
Most people did
then.
Yeah.
So would he mind about the ban? Would he think it's important if it's lifted?
No, he would think that it was somehow weak, apologetic, defensive in an unimpressive way, and it doesn't make sense for a collective authority to change its opinion 250 years later. So he would say, do not lift the ban. He would say, well, you should stick with your point of view, because I represent something different.
Okay, that's your point that you're probably going to make this afternoon.
Something along those lines.
In the Rode Hoed.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, you are a famous writer on Enlightenment, radical Enlightenment, also on Dutch history, your book, The Dutch Republic. You argue in your work that Spinoza, in fact, is the backbone of Enlightenment.
Not quite.
You don't?
No, what I argue is that the backbone of the democratic Enlightenment began in the Netherlands in a Dutch context among a group, which I called the Cercle Spinoziste. I think other historians call it that too. And I think it was a reaction to a specific Dutch situation. Now, Spinoza was the only great philosopher among this group who is still remembered now.
He stood out.
He stood out. The others, Franciscus van den Enden, Adrian Courbach, and others, were important then, but are mostly, on the whole, forgotten now. But it has to be understood as part of a structural situation in which there were deep divisions in Dutch society.
Could you say that in that era, in the Dutch Republic, 17th century, could you say that circumstances were favorable for Spinoza
No.
to write?
No, but I think it did reflect a real minority response to a critical situation. The situation, let's say, for instance, in 1650, after Willem II briefly, of course he died very young from smallpox, but briefly he overthrew what Johan de Witt called the true freedom, ware vrijheid. And the problem was that the Dutch republicanism, in its opposition to Orangism and the monarchical principle, let's say, in the Netherlands, was weak. It didn't have a broad support. So the question is, how do you make a wider support? How do you build a democratic republic? And Spinoza is the first great democratic philosopher. So this is a very important general question, as well as a very important question about the Dutch context of the Golden Age.
Yes, but could you
How
say
do you do it?
Yeah, could you say that Spinoza, if he had grown up in France or Germany, that he would have, in those circumstances, in those countries, have written the same?
No, his books were banned even in the Netherlands, but because in 1678 the States General imposed a general ban on Spinoza's philosophy and books. So in theory, at least, you were not supposed to read them in Holland. However, the Netherlands was relatively freer. I stress relatively because it's not as free as some people and not as tolerant as some people think it was in the 17th century.
No, it was also the country where the Witt brothers were murdered.
Absolutely.
A political murder in 1672, lynching. They were lynched.
Torn apart by the mob.
Near Parliament in The Hague.
Yes.
So that was
Spinoza worried a lot about the mob, even before the Witts were torn apart.
Yeah. So we were not that tolerant at all in those days.
Every society, Spinoza thought, is subject to being manipulated, and ugly forces can be mobilized. And that applies to the Dutch society just as it applied to all the others. He was living in an age of religious wars. He had seen how terribly ugly forces can be let loose quite easily, and they become very destructive, politically very destructive and socially very destructive. And he knew this very well, and he worried about it a lot.
Yeah. Let's turn to the Netherlands of the 21st century. It's very logical, I think, after what you said about the 17th century and Spinoza. Are we in any way a tolerant nation?
Yes, the Dutch are famous around the world as a tolerant nation, and I think Europe as a whole is a tolerant part of the world. But that doesn't mean that everyone in Dutch society and everyone in Europe is tolerant. And it also doesn't mean that the forces of intolerance aren't potentially strong in Europe and in Holland.
You could say that, well, if it's true that Spinoza was a man who could combine reason and religion, do you agree there?
Reason and religion as he defined religion.
Okay, you explained that.
Yeah.
But are we still a country that's prone to reason, in your view?
There can never be enough reason. I don't think you could. There may be more reason in one debate than in another debate. It's even possible that there's more reason in the politics of one country than another country at a certain moment.
Yeah, but you're you're the specialist on Dutch history.
Yes.
So you can compare then and now.
Yes. I think then and now, a tolerant balance has been devised, which is very precious and which needs to be defended and fought for, but which was very vulnerable then, and which is also vulnerable in a certain sense now. And so one has to think very carefully and also fight very hard to defend and protect what is precious and valuable.
Yes. Let's look more specifically at the debate, or part of the debate. There's one party in Dutch Parliament, let's be honest about that, who wants to diminish the number of Moroccan citizens in the Netherlands. That's the Netherlands of today, too.
Yes.
How reasonable is this idea? How sensible?
I think one should never single out Islam as a special element in this problem, because if you take a longer view of history, look at the Enlightenment, you can see that Islam always had a very impressive reputation for its defense of toleration. Actually, if you take the last 1,000 years into consideration, there couldn't be any question that Islam was much more tolerant, for instance, than Christianity. And people were very aware of this in the 18th and 19th centuries. So there's a great tradition of toleration, of coexistence of religions, and of protection of religious minorities. So that's something for the Islamic world to be very proud of. What Spinoza was worried about was religious authority, not one particular religion. And I think we should bear that in mind now. It's even possible to argue, in fact, there was an article in one of the American newspapers yesterday, that if you think that global warming and climate change is even more damaging or potentially destructive to our world than ISIS, which is a very rational argument, I think, then you could say that the religious authority which is most threatening to us right at this moment is not the religious authority that people are targeting and are thinking about, but another religious authority which makes it possible for a large block of opinion in the United States to think that the whole story about global warming is a conspiracy, a myth, thought up by a bunch of scientists, who've been congened by a group of theologians who have great authority in certain circles.
What you're in fact saying is that a religious authority might be a more forceful power than the religion itself. And you're saying that that's what Spinoza was worried about, is what religious authority could do to seduce people or to...
Not even that. I think if you read the preface to one of his most famous books, the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, the theological political tractate, he makes the point that that the religious belief of individuals can so easily be mobilized. In fact, he says every dictatorship, tyranny, and despotism has found an ideology, but usually a form of religion, but a perversion of religion, he would argue, to manipulate the public in such a way as to support that tyranny. And I think there's a lot of truth in this. He's certainly the first philosopher to emphasize how religious opinions have been used as a coercive force to manipulate not just minorities, but the whole public in a particular direction against their own interest. This is, I think, where he sees the heart of how he sees the clash between reason and religion.
In my simple words, how religion is being used by leaders. Let's turn to, again, the debate right now. A majority in our parliament wants to see if it's possible to forbid Salafism. One of the fastest growing, maybe the fastest growing Islamic movement of our days, fundamentalist movement. Is that a sensible idea to try and forbid that?
I'm very much opposed, I must say, to identifying particular religious strands or minorities. I think there's if one asks, should private schools or religious schools be allowed in the Netherlands or in any Western country, or should the state supervision of education mean that you don't have any religious schools? That's a really real question. But to say that one kind of religious teaching should not be allowed and other kinds of religious teaching are fine, I have a problem with that. I don't think we can do that.
Even if they preach violence?
No, preaching hatred and violence should not be allowed in a democratic republic.
So then you have to forbid
any context. But you're not forbidding the doctrine or the beliefs. You're only forbidding the preaching of hatred. To incite the hatred of against particular groups, I think, cannot be allowed in a democratic society. The democratic, by definition, a democratic society has to be intolerant of intolerance. It has to be intolerant of those that say who attack or incite hatred against particular groups.
You could say that since Paris, or maybe since 9/11, that Islam for many people has become the equivalent of fear. Could you say that reason and religion, those two important things for Spinoza, reason and religion have become more incompatible than ever?
No, I feel deeply, I don't think that there's been deep down any really great change. And what worries me about the current situation is that if one puts too much emphasis on Islam as the threat, how easily this can be used as a new form of intolerance and a new form of victimizing a particular minority, and as a new way of focusing negative attention in such a way as to be useful in an undemocratic manner for restricting freedoms and civil rights and so on. At the core of our values as a democratic society are universal and equal rights. And I think we have to keep that at the forefront of our minds all the time. And therefore, it's very important not to identify particular groups, but rather a particular style of behavior, or a particular intolerance, or way of preaching destructive intolerance as something that we can't allow.
As Amos Oz, the famous Israeli writer, said, he was at this table 3 weeks ago, he said, ISIS is an idea. It might be a desperate idea, but it's an idea. And you can't fight an idea with violence alone. You have to replace it. You have to find a better idea. Do you agree with him?
I agree absolutely, and that was the central problem of the democratic Enlightenment, that the majority of people in 17th, 18th and 19th century societies were swayed more by religion than by what they thought of as political and social reason. So you have to change the way people think, or the democratic republic can't work. I think that the radical Enlightenment thinkers thought in this way, and maybe they sometimes exaggerated their fears, I don't know, but I'm inclined to think that they didn't, and that is the heart of the problem, that the democratic republic, including our democratic republic today, can't work unless there is a strong commitment to it on the part of the population. There's no reason why that should conflict with individual beliefs. Every individual must be free to believe what they want, but it does conflict with the coercive organization of religious power in such a way as to force other groups to do or to think or to say things that they don't want to say, because then it's not just undemocratic, but damaging, harmful to us all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.